Hello and welcome to my channel. Today I have a lovely colored pencil landscape for you. It's a drawing of a mountain that's loosely based on a mountain in Serbia. I'm going to be using Faber Castell Polychromos colored pencils on 1000 grit sandpaper, and I'm going to show you how I did it. So the first thing I'm going to do is draw the outline of the mountain using a blue colored pencil. And the reason why I'm doing that is because this is the color that I'm going to be using for the sky, and I want a clean edge between the mountain and the sky. I want nice contrast between those two elements. And the color I picked for the color of the sky is going to be the light phthalo blue. I really like this color for a nice clear blue sky. Now I'm working on a 1000 grit sandpaper because this is a great surface for both colored pencils and pastel pencils. But one of the limitations of this surface that I'm using is the range of colors of the actual paper. They're usually grayish, and this one is bluish gray. And it's a little bit too dark in comparison to the target color that I'm trying to achieve. So I need to make sure that I cover the background here very thoroughly. So I can't really use blending tools much. I just have to cover all of this patiently, and the way to do this is to keep your pencil fairly sharp or relatively sharp, to go bit by bit using small circular motion, and to fight the temptation to use too much pressure. This way you can cover the background thoroughly, create a nice even color, and not ruin the texture of the paper and create some ugly looking textures and lines. Now after that I'm going to start drawing some clouds on that blue sky. I'm just going to draw a few clouds. I'm going to start with a white colored pencil. And the white colored pencil stands nicely against the blue, but sometimes this produces a little bit too much texture. So one of the ways I can soften that is by controlling the amount of pressure I'm using with my pencil. But the other way is using a pencil that is somewhere in between the blue and the white in terms of value, which is going to be the cool gray colored pencil, the light cool gray colored pencil, which is very, very light, and it's very close to a white colored pencil. So I can use that to soften those clouds a little bit, to soften their texture a bit, and to create a nice gradient here at the bottom, which is what I'm doing now with this light gray pencil. I'm getting closer to finishing the sky as I'm filling in the rest of it here on the right. I'm still working bit by bit because that's the way I have to do it if I want to cover it properly. So far I've only used the light phthalo blue, but here at the top I'm going to use a slightly darker color. This is a middle or a medium phthalo blue, which is just a little bit darker because I want to achieve a nice gradient. I want the sky to be a little bit darker at the top and then getting gradually lighter towards the horizon. So I kind of blended these two together and added a bit more of this darker phthalo blue at the top. Here closer to the horizon I'm making the sky a bit lighter by using this cool gray colored pencil and just going over the blue color gently, making it a little bit lighter overall. This is also going to be useful here because I want to create contrast with this part of the sky and the distant mountains, because I want to create some suggestions of mountains in the distance here. So I have this main mountain in the center, and then I'm going to have some mountains here in the distance, but these are going to be considerably less detailed. I just want to stack a few mountains here, and I'm going to make the ones that are closer to us darker using more of this darker phthalo blue, and then they're gradually getting lighter and lighter as you look further into the distance. So I'm trying to imitate that atmospheric effect and create that illusion of distance. After that, I'm just going to keep working on the sky, and I'm going to add a few more clouds here on the right as well, just to make the sky a bit more interesting and my whole drawing a bit more balanced. But I don't want to make it look exactly the same as the ones on the left, so I'm going to make this a little bit different. And of course, I'm using a combination of a white colored pencil and a light gray pencil to create that transition between the blue and the white. I'm using that grayish pencil, which is very light. It's almost white, but I prefer to use a cool one for the sky here, for the clouds, because it's closer to the blue color. So now I'm going to move on to the mountain, and the first thing I need to do is try to create some kind of a contrast between the light side and the shadow side of the mountain. The light source here is coming more from the right, which means that the right side, the right slope of the mountain, is going to be lighter. It's also going to be greener because it's covered with grass, while the shadow side on the left is a bit more rocky and a bit more wooded, as you will see. So for this light side of the mountain, the greeny, grassy side, I used the May green to start with, and then I'm going to be adding some other greens and some other colors on top of that. Now for the shadow side here, I'm going to be using some grayish colors and also this lighter gray for some of the lighter rocks. So some of the rocks here are a bit lighter in color, but they're also lighter because they're sticking out and catching a bit more light from the light source. So within this shadow side, we're going to have some contrast between the rocks which are catching a little bit of light and those which are completely in the shadow. And for those shadow areas, I'm going to add a touch of this darker blue. This is the ultramarine, this cooler blue, and this will give me a nice shadow color. And also, I'll also use that on top of this green that I already laid down to make those greenish parts feel like they're a little bit further away, by adding some bluish color on top of them and making them a little bit more blurry and less defined. So I'm going to add some more details here just to make the texture of this rocky part of the mountain more interesting. And basically what I'm trying to do is not just define the contrast between the lighter areas and shadow areas, I'm also trying to make the texture more interesting, and by doing that I'm also creating an illusion of detail. So I'm trying to trick the eye of the viewer that they're looking at something very detailed, that they're looking at rough rocky terrain. So I'm trying to stay consistent with the light source with each and every one of these parts of that rocky side of the mountain, so that the shadow side is always facing away from the light source. It's facing the left side, and the lighter bits are facing the right side where the light source is. Now in this lower part here in the middle, this is also a shadow side of the mountain, but it's facing a little bit more to the light source, so it's a little bit closer to the light source, and it's also covered with a lot of trees. So I'm going to try to create some suggestions of distant trees by using some darker greens here. I'm using a chrome oxide green, which is a very deep, rich, dark green. And of course I'm going to use some other colors in combination with that. So I'm going to use this May green on top of it just to create some variation and some suggestions of lighter tree tops which are sticking out and maybe catching a little bit more light from the light source. So just to make the texture a bit more interesting. But the idea is that this side of the mountain is covered with some trees in the distance. I'm also going to have a row of trees, or a couple of rows of trees stacked here on the left side. But I'm not going to get into defining those just yet. First I'm going to finish this side of the mountain and then kind of block in some of these green areas to the left. There's going to be a small path, a dirt path in the middle here, or just a little bit more to the left, and as you can see it's kind of winding away, and the part of the path which is closer to our viewpoint is obviously wider because of the perspective. And now I'm just blocking in this larger part, grassy part here in the foreground with some May green, and after that I'm gonna get on to defining these trees here on the left a little bit more. For that I'm gonna use a black colored pencil. I actually like combining a green and a black colored pencil when I draw trees, because using a black colored pencil on top of the green produces a very nice contrast, a very nice texture, and that texture kind of looks like foliage as seen from a distance. Of course it's not that simple. You can't just draw a bunch of dots and small marks. You have to try to break these larger shapes into smaller shapes to create suggestions of groups of trees. And I want to make it look like there's not just trees but also some bushes in front of them, and I want to make it look like some of these trees are a little bit taller than the others, and maybe some of them are kind of higher above the others because of the rough and uneven terrain. I don't really know if I'm going to be able to convey all of these things to the viewer, but I think that just by creating an interesting texture and creating some shadow areas here and there, I'll be able to explain to the viewer that this is some kind of wooded area here, that this is a large group of trees, kind of like a thick group of trees here. I'm also adding some yellowish details here and there on the lighter portions of these trees, and on the top of some of these canopies I had to add some more irregular shapes just to make those canopies appear more natural and realistic, because I don't want to make them look too round and smooth, like I don't know, like maybe somebody trimmed them. So I'm trying to make a more natural, realistic look. Here in the foreground, on this grassy area, I'm gonna combine these greens with some brownish tones, because I want to make it look like there's a lot of dry grass here, as well as some parts of this mountain slope which are kind of bare, where you can see just some dirt and some rocks maybe, but there's also a little bit of green grass here and there. So I'm going to use a number of different greens. I'm going to use some darker greens to give me give me some kind of shadow areas that I can work with, because on top of them I can draw some lighter grass which will stand out against that darker background. And I'm trying to make those vertical marks, making the larger marks in the foreground because these are closer to our viewpoint, and then kind of making them smaller and smaller and less defined as you look further into the distance. But I'm actually not going to leave them that well defined, because you obviously can't see every blade of grass at such a distance. So I'm kind of going to want to blur things a little bit. I'm just trying to establish some textures and some contrasts, and just sort of playing around with both the colors and the shapes, as well as the lighter and darker values, just trying to see what I can come up with. And here also in front of these trees and closer to this foreground area, I'm going to be adding some bushes, maybe some smaller trees and things like that. Not just to make the terrain a bit more interesting, but also to try to create that feeling of depth, or try to retain that feeling of depth by adding more objects one in front of the other, to suggest that some parts of that landscape are a bit further than the others, and just to create that illusion of depth and volume for the viewer. So a part of this path is going to be obscured by one of those bushes, and as you can see, I'm adding some yellowish tones here and there as well, so it's not just a combination of greens here and there. If I feel like I need to make something a bit more yellow, I'm going to add a touch of yellow here and there. I'm also going to add a touch of burnt ochre and maybe even a touch of red if needed, if I feel like I need to make something a bit warmer. So like I said, this landscape is based loosely on a mountain in Serbia, which kind of looks like this. It looks kind of rocky on one side and kind of bare for the most part on its slopes, with just a few trees here and there. So I think that the grass here is starting to look a little bit better in the foreground, mostly because I like the colors that I achieved, but I don't really necessarily like that texture, which kind of looks like short trimmed grass. Maybe I'm going to blur that a little bit and make that look a bit more irregular, just to make it look more like grass as you would see it from a distance. And I like this duller color of the grass that I achieved here and there, so I'm going to try to implement more of that on the right side, on this sunny side of the mountain, where I'm going to have a bit more of that dry grass and some of these bare areas. So I'm adding some yellowish tones on the other side of the mountain, but I also decided to go back in and kind of rework some of the trees. Now here on this light side of the mountain, I'm also going to add some of these lighter rocks here and there with a light gray pencil. And I don't know if I mentioned it, but for the mountain I used a little bit more of the light warm gray rather than a cool gray, because I wanted some slightly warmer, lighter colors. And now here I'm using this dark green to create some suggestions of very distant trees, or very distant clusters of trees, all the way around the edge of the mountain, all the way in the distance. These are going to be very small, like small dots, and they're going to be kind of getting larger and more defined as we move closer to the foreground, closer to our viewpoint. So I'm using this beige, light beige, to add some lighter marks here and there to break up the green color. But notice how I'm trying to follow the shape of the slope, or the angle of the slope, because I'm using this texture to create a feeling of the flow of the terrain. So the mountain slopes downwards to the right, and I'm pulling those lighter strokes in between the greenish areas to suggest that this is the shape of the terrain. So I'm not just doing that to make the colors and the textures more interesting. It has a purpose of explaining the topography of the terrain to the viewer as well. I'm kind of adding some more colors here and there, even a little bit of reddish tones, maybe a bit more bluish tones at the top, but mostly some slightly warmer and yellowish tones on this sunlit side and drier side of the mountain. And again, here and there I'm adding a few touches of this light grey so that it looks like we have some distant rocks there near the top, because it is rocky terrain. And even though this part on the left, or on the right rather, is a bit more grassy, I still want to have a few jutting rocks here and there to break the monotony of that grassy area, and to make the texture of the mountain appear a bit more interesting. Just going in with this light beige again, trying to define the shape of the slope a bit more. And after that, I'm just going to continue by adding more and more of these small groups of trees in the distance. And of course I'm going to vary their shape and size a little bit, because sometimes I'm using these small marks to represent individual trees, sometimes I'm using them to represent groups of trees, but sometimes I'm going to go over some of these green parts with a bit of black colored pencil if I feel like I need even darker shapes. But generally these shapes will be getting larger and larger as we move closer to the foreground. I used a little bit of this very light ivory colored pencil on the dirt path to make some parts of it a bit lighter. And now I'm just working a bit more on the color and the texture of this foreground area, because I'm kind of getting closer to the foreground area and adding some more of these small trees and bushes. So some parts of the mountain are kind of more bare and rocky than the others, while others have a little bit of wooded areas on them. I'm going to draw a nice tree here in the middle. Using the same technique, I'm using black colored pencil on top of the green. And of course, I'm trying to create some uneven shapes and some suggestions of texture of leaves or of foliage, as well as some suggestions of shadow areas, trying to stay consistent with the light source, because those shadow areas are mostly going to be down and on the left. And there's also a little bit of shadow under that tree. That shadow is being cast from right to left, again because of the light source. So that too will add a little bit to the depth and realism, because I'm going to try to include these small shadows and to make sure that they are all cast in the same direction. Just reworking that row of trees once again, trying to add some more interesting shapes there, and then going back to the foreground area to draw some more trees and bushes here and there. Again, like I said, I'm varying their size a little bit. Some of them are a little bit taller and larger than the others. Some of them are very small. I'm just trying to make sure that the ones that are further away in the distance are very small. But I still want to fill this slope on the right with more of these darker shapes, because well, for two reasons essentially. I want to make it look more interesting. I don't want to leave it just sort of plain and blank like that. I also want to create some feeling of depth, and when I add more objects and the viewer has an opportunity to compare the distance and the size of those objects, then that gives him some kind of a feeling of depth, like they're looking at an actual landscape, like they're looking up the mountain, and some of those trees and bushes which are further up are getting smaller and smaller and obviously barely visible as your gaze moves closer to the top of the mountain. Just a few more shapes here at the bottom on the right, and the drawing is going to be finished. This is probably a good time for me to remind you to check out my other drawings and my other landscapes, and to subscribe if you haven't already. If you want to see longer videos with a lot more narration and explanations and some real-time footage, then you should go and check out my Patreon. Now, as you can see, I'm removing the tape from these corners and filling that in, kind of wrapping things up. I normally tape the drawing in just a few places. I normally don't go all around the border or all around the edge. That's what I meant. So I'm just putting down some finishing touches, some darker touches on those distant bushes and trees. And here on the right, I want to clean up this edge to enhance that contrast so that the mountain would really stand out against the sky. But like I said, these are just some finishing touches. The drawing is mostly done. And now I'm just going to put my signature in the lower left corner here in the among the grass and bushes. And that's it. The drawing is done. I hope you enjoyed the drawing process, and I hope you like this landscape in colored pencil. So I'm going to see you in the next one. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.